The Victorian Era, which lasted throughout most of the 19th century, isn't exactly known for its easygoing attitude about social conventions, and death was no exception. During this period, elaborate mourning rituals became the norm, and those who didn't follow these highly regimented grief practices were socially shamed. So, today, we're going to take a look at the bizarre ways people from Victorian England mourned the dead. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel and let us know in the comments below what other Victorian topics you would like to hear about. Okay, let's bring out your dead for this Victorian mourning.
Bring out your dead!
These days, commemorating the dead mostly involves putting on dark clothing and saying a few nice things about the life of the deceased. But when it came to memorializing the dead, the Victorians were not afraid to do things that would be considered a little unconventional by modern standards. As those who saw our video about how Victorians spent their free time already know, commemorating the dead was extremely popular during the Victorian era. In fact, portions of the deceased hair would be often clipped off and turned into jewelry, like brooches, lockets, rings, watch fobs, and wreaths. But what if a family wasn't particularly crafty, or were too sad to create these things themselves? No worries. If a family couldn't manage it for themselves, they could always send the hair off to an artisan who would do it for them. Failing that, a lock of the deceased hair could always be simply placed in a scrapbook. Anyway, to be completely fair, human hair brooches aren't really that strange considering this was the same society that made fans out of preserved birds, contorted taxidermied cats into humans posing for photographs, unwrapped mummies for fun, and made public visits to the morgue. In modern times, we're accustomed to receiving fancy invitations to events like weddings and sweet 16s. But the Victorians took the use of stationery to a whole other level. That is, they would often send out fancy funeral invitations to close friends and members of the family. Just like today, death notices and obituaries were published in newspapers during the Victorian era. But it would be near impossible to know whether all the right people would see the death notice or read the obits on the right day. This was especially so for those loved ones who lived out of town and might not even get the same newspaper. The funeral invitations were typically written on black-bordered stationery and sent in matching envelopes. At one point, people even petitioned the United States Postal Service to create a special mourning stamp just for these purposes. Stamps were usually printed in bright, cheerful colors and didn't exactly seem appropriate for the occasion. The Victorians had some pretty strict social expectations regarding women grieving over their lost husbands. For the morally upright and respectable Victorian widow, there existed 3 distinct mourning stages, all of which had to be observed before a widow could move on with her life. The first, called deep mourning, required a widow to wear a black dress and veil, known as widow's weeds, for a year and 1 day after her husband's death. You might think that's enough, but there were actually still 2 full stages to go. The next period, called second mourning, lasted for 9 to 12 additional months. During this time, she could take off the veil, but still had to primarily wear black. This was already 21 to 24 months after the husband's death, and there's still another stage to go. The third and final stage, known as half mourning, lasted for another 6 months. Women in this period of mourning could wear colored clothing with black accents, but nothing too gaudy. Finally, after a period of 27 to 30 months, the widow could go back to wearing whatever she wanted. Of course, by that point, all of her clothes were probably out of style. The rules governing men in mourning were a lot more forgiving than those governing women. For example, unlike widows, a widower could remarry at any time during the mourning process. If he had young children and no adult women in the family, someone had to take care of the children while he worked, so he would choose a new wife. That being said, there were still some rules to follow. On his wedding day, the widower did not have to wear his mourning outfit of a black suit and hat. However, he did have to put them on the very next day, and his new wife had to go into mourning as well until the customary period ended. Photography was developed during the mid-1800s. So, while this may be hard to imagine in a time when everyone didn't have a high-def camera in their pocket, it was still relatively expensive during the Victorian period. In fact, in many cases, people simply could not afford happy family portraits like they can today. So, when the opportunity for a photograph arose, you had to make the most of it by creating a lasting image of something truly significant in your life. which might actually turn out to be someone else's death. One method of maximizing a photo op was to take a picture with a deceased loved one to commemorate them forever. And when a loved one died, family members would do their best to scrape up the money necessary to have a picture taken with the deceased. This would often be the only photo that existed of their now fractured family. Smile, everybody? Oh, except for you. You're dead. If you heard someone talking about mourning biscuits, you'd probably think they were stopping at McDonald's on their way to work. But to the Victorians, it meant something very different. After a funeral, a formal lunch or dinner would be served for the mourners. Those who couldn't attend the meal were given a special funeral biscuit or a cookie called a mourning biscuit. These spiced, buttery snacks were wrapped in paper with sad poems, information about the deceased, Bible verses, or prayers on them, and they were tied closed with a black ribbon. The paper was intended to be kept as a funeral souvenir, similar to the prayer cards of today. One of the stranger Victorian death customs involved covering all of the mirrors, portraits, and shiny objects, like vases, in the house with black crepe fabric. This was considered to be a necessary posthumous practice for a number of reasons. For one, covering all shiny things with black fabric effectively put the house into mourning, because shiny things, in all of their inappropriate shininess, were viewed as an insult to the family in mourning. On top of that, the Victorians believed that the dead could appear in mirrors, get trapped there, and beckon other family members to follow them into the afterlife. That is pretty creepy, so it's understandable that covering shiny surfaces to prevent that possibility would be a necessary step. The Victorians had some pretty seriously over-the-top mourning traditions, but tear vials, or lacrimatories, from the word lacrimos, might take the cake. As their name states, they are literally small glass vials with rubber or cork stoppers used for catching the tears of mourners during services for the deceased. During the wake and the funeral, mourners would hold the vials up to their faces in order to catch their tears. After the service, these vials would be presented to the family of the deceased as a way to prove how much that person would be missed. Tear vials were also really handy in helping a mourning family decide how long an appropriate mourning period should be. Basically, once the tears in the vials were all dried up, mourning could cease. So, if you're thinking that all these traditions and practices associated with mourning sound like they would be a lot to remember, you are not alone. Even the Victorians themselves had trouble keeping it all straight. But, luckily for these fastidious and respectable Victorian mourners, a person didn't have to commit all of the rules of mourning to memory. Conveniently enough, there were special published mourning manuals that would outline all of the rules for you. One of the many effects of the Industrial Revolution on Victorian society was the advent of industries specifically created around mourning customs. As part of this, books were published and distributed that contained details about how to properly mourn. These books contained sections on clothing, manners, food, and behaviors, among other things. Whether the deceased was on his way to the funeral home for embalming or off to the church for the funeral ceremony, he could not be removed from the home head first. Instead, it was essential that he go out feet first. The Victorians believed that if the dead were removed head first, they would use the opportunity to beckon family members, insisting one of their relatives follow them into death, something which clearly wouldn't work if they were being carried the other way. It makes sense, if you really wanted to. Although funeral homes did exist during the Victorian period, they weren't the one-stop shopping death service parlors that exist today. In fact, they were mainly just places where a body was embalmed. Services weren't held in them. Instead, the deceased body was placed in a casket and then displayed in the parlor of his or her home. Friends, neighbors, and relatives would visit to say goodbye and to comfort grieving loved ones. And some combination of people would be with the body, holding vigil 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, until it was interred. Embalming had been around for centuries, but, Egyptian mummies notwithstanding, truly effective modern embalming had not yet been perfected by the Victorian era. In fact, they were still using arsenic as a preservative at that point. As a result, fresh flowers were needed around the body at all times in order to mask the pungent aroma of a body decomposing. There were no air conditioners at the time, so a summertime wake was in special need of the aromatic service that flowers provided. Although flowers continued to be associated with funerals as a token of respect, they no longer served the dual purpose of the Victorian period. Victorian customs dictated that someone had to sit alongside the body of the deceased the entire time that he or she was laid out in the home. There are many reasons for this, including the idea that it comforted the dead and helped them better transition to the afterlife. More practical ideas for this constant vigil involved the need to keep rodents away from the body, to be near just in case the deceased wasn't truly dead, and to greet anyone who traveled a long way to pay their respects, arriving at an odd hour. Mourning rituals weren't just for adults to follow. Children had to wear mourning clothing and follow a certain set of behaviors as well. If the child was under the age of 12, he or she could wear regular clothing, but had to include a black armband during the winter months, or a gray one during the spring and summer, as well as matching clothing accents. As for children over the age of 12, they wore standard mourning clothing that was the same as the adults. So what do you think? Which fact do you think is the weirdest? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.